Hello, my name's Jason. I'm not an archaeologist, but I do play one on TV. So come join me as we go into the dust. Okay, today we're going to be speaking with Tom Booth. Now, Tom is a scientist at the Crick Institute, just a few blocks from here, which I believe is the largest biomedical research institute in Europe. He'll correct me if I'm wrong on that. Of course, named after Francis Crick, who discovered the double helix structure of DNA along with James Watson. Anyway, Tom is an interesting character in archaeology because he studied traditional archaeology like I'm studying. He did that at the University of Sheffield, where he stayed through to his PhD. And incidentally, his advisor, his supervisor, was Mike Parker Pearson, who we've interviewed on this channel. Now, anyway, after that, Tom found his way into science, particularly ancient DNA, aDNA, which we've talked a lot about, and that is revolutionizing the study of archaeology. So he's someone who really bridges those two worlds, and I'm sure that's what we're going to be talking about today most of the time. Thank you for joining me, Tom.
No problem. It's good to be here.
Great. Well, first thing, I want to hear a little bit more about that journey. How did you get into science from studying something like archaeology, which, depending on how you take it, can be very airy-fairy and very interpretive? So how did you make that transition and why?
Well, my degree was in archaeological science. I was always more minded towards the scientific parts of archaeology, or at least the parts that used scientific methods to answer archaeological questions. And then through my degree, I got more interested in the human osteology, so the study of human bones and what we can learn from the analysis of human bones about past individuals and past societies. And that then led, I didn't really have a clear goal in mind. I thought vaguely perhaps I would like to do something forensic-y, perhaps become a professional human osteologist, although then, as now, there are a lot of people who get qualifications as human osteologists, but there are nowhere near enough jobs to fulfill. So I was kind of quite realistic about career prospects in going into human osteology. It's something I would like to do, but I knew that it was quite a tough environment. And then when it came to doing my master's thesis, I went into quite a niche area, which is bone diagenesis. So this is understanding, diagenesis refers to, when applied to bone, the transformation of the bone in the ground from sort of an organic or partially organic material into something that's purely inorganic. So the transformation from the biosphere to the lithosphere, so the loss of organic material and then the fossilization of the rest of the bone. And one of the key processes in that is the way that the bone is degraded by bacteria in the ground. So after you die, the bone doesn't sort of stay a static thing. It's degraded, and particularly by bacteria getting in, they eat away the protein inside your bone and create these little tunnels that go through the bone. And first of all, it's been there's a sort of persistent mystery as to what the bacteria responsible for these tunnels, which bacteria they are, where they come from, whether they're associated with the decomposing body, or whether they come from the soil and attack the bone from there, or whether it's a mixture of both things to some extent. But there'd been these key observations that found that the way that this bioerosion, this bacterial bioerosion in bone seemed to be related to early post-mortem treatment. So butchered animal bones tended not to show very much bacterial attack, whereas bones from articulated animal skeletons or articulated human burials tended to show extensive bacterial attack. And this seemed to be the case, even if they were in very similar environments a lot of the time. So the idea for my master's, and then which sort of fed into my PhD, was looking at the variability in bioerosion in bones and trying to see what you could infer from that about potentially the treatment of the body. And that's why I ended up working with Mike, because he was interested in funerary treatment and had done similar work or been involved in similar work on some skeletons that were found up in South Uist, which is part of the Outer Hebrides.
Oh, is that Clad Hallen?
Yeah, Clad Hallen.
Got it. Yep.
Exactly, where there was a lot of different evidence, radiocarbon dating and osteological evidence to suggest that these ostensibly single skeletons were actually composed of mummified parts of several different individuals, and there'd been mummification. And I was interested in seeing whether, well, broadly, what would happen if you applied this method to skeletons from all over the country at different, particularly prehistoric time periods, to look at the diversity of funerary treatment that you have in prehistoric Britain, but also to see whether you could find any evidence of mummification in other places. So that was the main thrust of what I was doing for my PhD, which had nothing to do with ancient DNA. And then, while this was going on, ancient DNA was really kicking off as a field, as something that was doable. So you had quite a few false starts through the 90s and the 2000s where people were using these older methods, PCR, Sanger sequencing, to get bits of ancient DNA out of ancient remains. And this was working quite well in some respects for remains of animals. But humans, it was always really tricky because you couldn't be sure whether the bit of DNA you were getting back was from a human or from the ancient human that you were studying, or was contamination from someone that had touched the bone in the past. And there was only these, relatively speaking, small sequences of DNA that people were getting out of bones, which were and which made it tricky to figure out whether it was coming from a modern person or an ancient person. So it was it had reached a certain point, ancient DNA, but it was sort of bobbing along at a point where no one was really sure what the results were saying. And then, maybe we'll get on this later, next generation sequencing came along, which meant we could produce a lot more data, and that led to being able to, from ancient human remains, rather than sort of one or two sequences, a few dozens of base pairs long or thousands of base pairs long, people were doing sort of hundreds of thousands of sequences that were dozens of base pairs long, so getting much more information. And that was just that was sort of kicking off just as I was finishing my PhD. And as I said, my PhD was nothing to do with ancient DNA, but indirectly this bacterial degradation of bone that I was looking at is related to DNA preservation. And the problem that a lot of labs were having, that even though they were able to generate a lot of, or the early ancient DNA labs were having, was even though they were able to generate a lot of data from these ancient remains, most of the sequences that we were getting back were from environmental organisms, bacteria, soil organisms, fungi that had gotten into the bone, and maybe 1 or 2% would be ancient human, which made the whole enterprise, they could still get useful and interesting results, but it made the whole enterprise very uneconomic, in that even though next generation sequencing had meant sequencing costs had plummeted, it was still the most expensive, or one of the most expensive parts of the process. So if you're spending all this money on sequencing and you're getting only a tiny, tiny proportion of your sequences are coming out as human, then it was just really hideously uneconomical. So there was this new ancient DNA project that was starting at the Natural History Museum, led jointly by Ian Barnes, who is the ancient DNA lead at the Natural History Museum in London, and Mark Thomas, who is at the biology department in UCL, that was aiming to sequence DNA from human remains in Britain to look at evolution, migration, all of the things that you can use ancient DNA to do. And it just so happened that was when they were starting that project, just when I finished my PhD, and they hired me as a postdoc on that project, in part because I had contacts in museums, in archaeological units where human remains are kept, to be able to get samples. But also the idea was that because of my background looking at bioerosion and degradation of bone, I will be able to help get around this problem of the fact that you were getting too many sequences from the environment and not enough from the human, and maybe find the bones where preservation was better. As it turned out, a few months after I started, a lab in Dublin stumbled upon the fact, well, not stumbled upon, through research, they realised that probably the most likely place you were going to be able to get DNA from, human DNA, is the Petrous portion of the temporal bone. The temporal bone is the bone on the side of your head around your ear. The Petrous portion surrounds your ear canal. It makes this pyramidal-like structure around your ear canal. And it's called the Petrous because, Petrous literally means stone-like, so it's because it's so dense. And it's the densest bone in the human body, partly because it seems to be more highly mineralized than other bones in the body, so that the mineral content is higher, which protects the organic fraction, including the DNA. And also because it's very the type of bone that's inside it is this lamellar bone, which again is very dense. Whereas if you think about your long bones, they are also very dense, made of dense cortical bone, but they remodel in response to stress. And when your bone remodels, which is where new bone is laid down in different orientations to respond to the stresses that your body's undergoing every day, the musculoskeletal stress that your bones are experiencing. It often involves your body sort of introducing a new blood supply through the formation of these structures called osteons, which is essentially a blood vessel surrounded by bone. And what that means that cumulatively over time, bones that are under a lot of musculoskeletal stress, like your long bones of your femur that seem dense, are accumulating all these little holes, so these pores that are as a result of remodeling. And those pores, after you die, are empty and allow things like bacteria and deleterious chemicals from the environment to get inside your bones and degrade the bones of the bacteria. Whereas the Petrous basically forms in utero, and because its primary function isn't really musculoskeletal, it has to stay solid because it forms an important part of your your hearing function. It doesn't remodel and it just stays the same, and it stays this dense lamellar bone as well. So it makes it very resistant to degradation, and that's why the DNA preserves well in there. So people started sampling Petrouses around the year, I think about 2014, when I started in ancient DNA, and found that they were an incredibly rich source of DNA. I mean, they're not a magic bullet. They don't work all the time. They're not totally immune to degradation, but they made a lot of difference. You had some Petrous bones that rather than getting 1% human DNA, you would maybe get 50, 60, 70% in good ways. So that meant that the sequencing became much more economical. You could do more samples and get more data and get richer things. So that sort of obliterated the need for me to have had this background, but at the same time, it did mean that I sort of continued in this project and got on the ground floor.
Got it.
And I mean, when I began working on that project, I thought I knew something about DNA, but I knew nothing, if I'm totally truthful, because hardly anybody did at that stage. It was because it was such a burgeoning field, it had only just started kicking off. It was only a very small subset of practitioners who knew the potential and where it was going. But through working at the Natural History Museum and then more recently at the Crick, I developed a good working knowledge of how the ancient DNA works, and of the methods and the analyses and sort of how it can be integrated with more traditional archaeological data.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, I think I'm old enough to remember when the human genome was first sequenced, and it's amazing how fast the discipline has moved since then. What was that, 2001, 2003, something like that?
Yeah, although it depends who you talk to, because even when they said the whole genome was sequenced, there were still bits missing. And then I think it was 2 years ago now, they said that was the
totally
definite.
Yeah.
But I think there still are bits and pieces missing, because there are parts of the genome that are very hard to sequence because they're essentially, or the vast majority of the sequences are essentially the same thing, just repeated over and over again, and which makes it very difficult. And I mean, there's the thing about DNA is that it's not just the nucleotides, so the molecules represented by the CTAG letters of the sequence, which people associate with DNA. There's structure within the DNA that also contribute to the variation. So it's not just about what letter is where, it's also sometimes where that letter is relative to, where that nucleotide is relative to other nucleotides, and how they're organized within the DNA structure as well.
Yep, and definitely. It's so I didn't know that it was still there were still some questions there, but in any event, it has moved very fast. And you pinpointed there the costs. You know, people who are not in archaeology often don't realize the resource constraints, so they just figure, oh, get the DNA, do the radiocarbon date. Like this all costs a lot of money, and the fact that the cost has come down so much must be fueling a lot of this research.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's mainly what's facilitated it. So, as I mentioned earlier, the next generation sequencing technology, which allowed parallel sequencing, just allows you to generate many more times data that you could before for a kind of similar cost than the older sequencing. So it was a lot about economics. And the thing is that the sequencing keeps going down as new instruments come out and they're more efficient. So even sort of 15 years ago, the cost of, say, doing 5 ancient genomes, you could probably do sort of 100 or so now. It's rapidly dropping, and then that's what's facilitating, the fact that 10 years ago you maybe had 2014, you maybe had a couple of dozen ancient individuals where you had genome-wide information, whereas now it's over 10,000, and that's a large part because the sequencing costs are a lot cheaper.
Got it. So we went very deep very quickly. Let's
Sorry,
zoom out a bit. No, that's fine. That's
dove in.
fine. Yeah, we dove right in. With someone with a background in archaeological sciences, is archaeology a science?
I think archaeology is too amorphous in some ways and diverse a subject to pin it down in some ways. There are parts of archaeology that definitely aren't a science, and the parts that are, and then there are also parts that use science to try and answer or address questions that aren't necessarily questions that are traditionally scientific, in the way of having simple hypotheses that you try and falsify that contribute to other archaeological goals, or trying to understand what it was like living in the past. One of them, these more sort of imaginative ones that are slightly intangible, but certain archaeologists strive for in their work, which can't really be unraveled simply through applying science to it. And from a hardcore scientific perspective, you would never be able to know and would never be knowable to some extent, but it's not worth. But then part of archaeology is speculating and exploring the possibilities rather than sticking rigidly to a methodological, a strictly scientific methodological approach that, with a strict epistemology about what can and can't be known to some extent. And it's worthwhile doing that because the point is to fire people's imaginations about what was possible in the past and what could have happened in the past, I think, is one of the goals. And I mean, I think sometimes those contrasting goals of different components of archaeology and a sort of a hard science like archaeogenetics is sometimes what causes some of the friction, in that they sort of have different goals and different means of achieving those goals sometimes. But I mean, archaeology is, and I know that the term is thrown around a lot, but it is it's truly interdisciplinary. People who do archaeology never have just one discipline that they're immersed in. They have to have several, and it's the nature. I mean, when I was at Sheffield, they didn't allow it after a while, but the archaeology department was in both the Faculty of Arts and the Faculty of Science, and the people who were doing the BSc got a BSc degree through the Faculty of Science, and the people doing the arts degree got a BA. Eventually, they got forced into the Faculty of Arts, but I think that it's truly archaeology. I don't think you can really say it's a science or a sort of a purely science or purely humanities subject, because it's much too diverse in its topics of study and in its interests to be kind of pigeonholed in that way. I know it's quite a hipster thing to say that you don't want to be pigeonholed, but I mean, it's impossible to do when you understand the breadth of what archaeologists look at and study.
Yeah, I mean, I think the art actually is integrating the art and the science together. It's a weird comparison, but it reminds me of my background in being a management consultant, where you have to do modeling and you have to use a lot of data, but ultimately what you're doing is speculative and is subjective, and it's sort of establishing the burden of proof that you're comfortable with, and people are comfortable with very different burdens of proof, which is sometimes the friction. You mentioned you came from Sheffield. I think that department no longer exists, or it's been dismembered to some extent, which represents some of the funding problems we have in archaeology.
Absolutely. I mean, it has a lot to do with the funding models in universities as well, that it's a lot to do with universities moving towards more being like businesses. And as businesses, they can only keep the courses that are generating lots of revenue and having lots of students apply to them. And similarly, students, because they are going to be loaded with a lot more debt than they used to be, are focusing more towards courses where there's a clear job at the end of it and a clear advantage. So it's more of a shift, in my view, a detrimental shift towards seeing university as something that gets you a job rather than something that enriches you as a person, and as well as potentially also getting you a job, or adds to the is of benefit to society as a whole, rather than to just an individual, to have well-informed people who are studying subjects that are that don't necessarily end up with you earning a lot of money at the end of it. So yeah, I mean, there is funding as well. That is an issue, and that's again a thing that drives some of the friction, is that ancient DNA attracts, or is still attracting, a lot of money, understandably so, and is plugged into revenue streams which archaeology is more, or is not as well suited to get involved in. So it's often that ancient DNA is much better funded and is able to get their work in sort of scientific journals that are a lot more tangible, or a lot more in the public in the public sphere than sort of the normal archaeological journals. So the research gets out there and sets the narrative for particular periods of archaeology. And if the archaeology in those papers is underexplored, or if archaeologists feel that it isn't really discussed in a good enough way, it's frustrating, because however they depict the archaeology in those ancient DNA papers, that becomes how most people see this particular period that they're having in these ancient DNA papers, because the other work, the sort of longer slog stuff on the artifacts, on the interpretation of sites, is sort of much more under the surface in these smaller scale archaeology journals that don't get as much particularly press attention or as much money. So it can be frustrating that both on the funding level and also the attention, the sort of cultural capital that these ancient DNA studies are given above some of the smaller scale ones that maybe explore the archaeology in more detail and with greater nuance. Yeah.
Well, that's, talking about some of that friction, let's dive right in. Big question. How would you say aDNA has changed archaeology on a big level? And then what are some of the pitfalls?
Well, I mean, the main way is that archaeology has always struggled with the question of understanding whether cultural change that you see in the archaeological record is a result of, or to what extent it's a result of migration, new people moving with different cultural traditions from one place to another and influencing the cultural traditions of the people who were already in that area, or how much it's to do with cultural diffusion. So aspects of a group of people's lifestyles becomes desirable for some reason, so people just take it on without there being necessarily significant movements of people, and then there's a domino effect where then people adjacent to that population take on people adjacent to that population and take it on. And distinguishing between those two things from the archaeological record is very difficult without something like ancient DNA, because all you really have are proxies of population movement that you might say that, well, if this is changing and this is changing and this is changing, the size of this change is, and it's all encompassing and towards all aspects of life, that it has to be actual people moving to create such a big change. But then you can always make the argument, well, if these aspects were desirable enough, then people can make big changes in your life. If you think about the cultural changes that there's been even over the last 200 years, huge cultural changes, across the world that have not been mediated by migration, have been a result of, for instance, America's cultural imperialism across the world that hasn't been mediated by any kind of migration. You take that and fundamentally, and this comes down to what we're talking about burdens of proof, it's difficult to use the material record to make any certain statements about migration and population movement, because they're always going to be proxies and can always be explained by other means. What ancient DNA has been able to do is that you see at least the consequences of population movement directly. So you see ancestry changes on a level that can only have occurred if individuals and groups of people were moving from one place to another. And I think that's been the main key thing. How you interpret those changes in terms of mechanisms, in terms of process, is a much more complicated question. But simply being able to say for certain that in this period, people were moving from here to there and had children in the new place. And again, that's kind of a weakness of ancient DNA in some levels, is that it's measuring a certain type of migration where people move and have children in the new place. If someone moves and doesn't have children, then you won't necessarily see it over a broad scale. But ancient DNA is measuring these sort of patterns of movement, and largely these patterns of movement and settlement, so particular types of migration. But actually having that framework of saying, okay, we see cultural change in this period, and the ancient DNA evidence tells us that there's migration, and then you can now plausibly, with a sort of high standard of proof, make a link between the two and say that these two are probably related to each other in some capacity.
And then combined with another sort of form of science that's emerging rapidly is isotopic studies. So you can say not only was this person, I don't know, looking at Germanic a lot recently, they were Germanic and they were from Germany versus they were born here.
Yeah, and this is the interesting thing, is having these two methods emerging, stable isotopes and going a bit longer than ancient DNA, but around the same time, because they're complementary. So a stable isotope analysis tells you something about the geology of the person when they grew up as a child, and whether the place where their remains were recovered was different to the place where they grew up as a child. So you can infer individual mobility within a person's lifetime. And the methods are getting more and more sophisticated. So it started where you were only looking at sort of a broad childhood origin and a broad and the place where they were buried, whereas now you can do this incremental stable isotope analysis where you can chart movement through childhood and then potentially sometimes movement later in life. So it's getting much more sophisticated. What ancient DNA tells you more about is broader changes where you get migrations which are influencing the ancestry. So it's more a person's ancestral background and the population movements that occurred kind of in the recent past and the genetic changes that occurred. And those things are complementary. So you could have, for instance, a person who has ancestry, who sort of died in Britain, that has ancestry from Britain, but maybe their isotope signature says that they grew up maybe somewhere in continental Europe. So you could have had maybe two people who moved from Britain to somewhere in what's now Germany, had a child, that child grew up in what's now Germany, then moved back to Britain. So you'd have a contrasting mix of their ancestry and their stable isotope information. So you're getting these two methods together provide what's often been called these osteobiographies of individual people, where you get a sense of where these two things complement each other, and you get a sense not just of the ancestry, the broader scale changes that occur in a person's past or in a population's past, but also how they're moving as individuals in their lifetime as well. So you get these quite sophisticated understandings of individual biographies. Similarly, you could have a local person who grew up locally, who maybe their parents had moved from continental Europe to Britain, who would have sort of non-local ancestry, but then a local stable isotope signature as well. So you can see those patterns of different generations of immigrants and movements, which work incredibly well together to build pictures of people in the past rather than sort of abstract populations.
Yeah, I mean, what's amazing is the different scales that allows us to work at the big scale, like where did all these people come from? Who was this society? And then what did this lady here do? Where was she born? What was her family structure? But still, there's always an interpretive element. So I know in some places they found where they have pretty stable societies, but they keep finding women coming in and getting married into these groups, single women. Were those people slaves? Were they high status women who on their own volition decided to move and took a place of honor in that family? That's where a lot of the interpretation and the archaeology really comes in.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's the diversity, and that we see in terms of movement and trying to figure out. Clearly, there are some cases that you can only really be sure that a woman is likely to have moved for marriage if you then find their child. So there's potentially other interpretations that you could apply to that movement. I mean, yeah, if you're getting broader movements like that, then you can say, and other features that are typical of, say, patrilocal societies that practice female exogamy, then you can make those interpretations. It seems reasonable to make interpretations about the female exogamy, and but yeah, I think it's a mistake sometimes and I think sometimes ancient DNA does this, to be too general and to assume that that's all that's happening with female mobility. And I think that archaeology is something that does this well, where it drills down and with a stable isotope analysis into the context of the burial, rather than these broader trends, and sort of say, is it like that this particular individual? What are the other interpretations that could explain this particular individual in terms of their movement? And in some cases, probably the most likely interpretation is that they move for marriage, but there's lots of other possibilities for why women moved around in the past and were potentially mobile. And I think increasingly we're seeing archaeologists get a bit more familiar with the genetics data and being able to bring different interpretations to that. That's why it's quite exciting to work in this field at the moment. Is, well, I think one of the major differences between, say, archaeogenetics and archaeology, which is salient to this question, is that archaeogenetics works on a very much a probabilistic basis, and on that basis, the idea is that the simplest explanation is the one that you kind of favour, because it requires the least number of assumptions. So again, that often leads to very general interpretations of broader phenomena that don't involve too many complications, where you're having to make assumptions about the number of different processes that you're seeing here. But I'd say that archaeologists' tendency is to explore as many different, by bringing in different forms of evidence, exploring all the different ways that these interpretations, that these data could be explained, things like female mobility. And I think that's where it contrasts, and I think that some of the friction comes from the fact that some archaeologists, at least in the past, felt that this simplest explanation, which was quite generalized, they were assuming that the argument for the archaeogeneticists was that the genetics supports this interpretation specifically and no others, when actually often what the geneticists would say is that this is the least that we can say to some extent. This is how we would interpret it in simple terms, but that there could be a myriad of other ways in which this could be interpreted that we can't distinguish between with our data really very, very easily. And that's the point, is that if a geneticist feels like they can't really distinguish between different interpretations of the data than they have, then it's probably not worthwhile to try and go through each and every one and discuss them, because they can't do it. Whereas an archaeologist would try and explore every single possibility to try and cover all bases and try and bring in other bits of evidence to say which is more supported by the archaeology and why. Yeah, I
mean, it's something, me coming into this later and sort of watching in hindsight the growth and evolution of this discipline, it's something that I think in the popular consciousness is seen as sort of an unalloyed good. If you see a lot of the archaeology clickbait, like history rewritten, a lot of that, it's aDNA behind it. So it definitely does answer a lot of questions. I mean, what I'm studying now, which is early medieval Britain, to see the genetic intrusion into it here, from the, quote, Germanic people, that answers a lot of questions. However, when it first came about, there were a lot of archaeologists that were resistant, almost the same way as radiocarbon dating way back when. A lot of archaeologists were resistant to that. So in talking about some of these simplistic explanations, some of the controversies, what have been some of the pitfalls in integrating aDNA with archaeological research?
Some of the terminology is difficult from genetics. So particularly the term population replacement, and you can see the way that this is taken, particularly in the press releases around and the media around certain studies, particularly ones on early medieval Britain. Population replacement in genetics means something very specific, where you see a large-scale shift in the ancestry of an organism living in a particular area. And this can happen, this can be quick or it can be very fast. It can happen over centuries. And if you're talking about population replacement of one deer species by another, or one ancestry of deer from another ancestry of deer, it doesn't really come with so much baggage. But when you start talking about population replacement involving humans, then people unconsciously bring a lot of baggage to that about what that means. Yep. And that you can see it particularly in the press, but in the way that people naively talk about genetics papers sometimes, is that population replacement implies that there has to have been some dramatic wipeout of the local population, whether by violence or disease or otherwise.
And you see some of those headlines. There was one a few years ago about the Yamnaya being the most violent people. Sometimes archaeologists help contribute to that. I remember there was a quote about that needing to have been a genocide. So, yeah, that has brought back some old narratives.
And this is what winds archaeologists up particularly is, and, in certain cases rightly so, in that, you with the genetics, you can say that a change happened. You can have a broad sense of the time scale over which it happened. And there are certain things that might hint at the mechanisms, but it can't, of how that happened, but it can't tell you exactly how it happened. For that, you need to look at the archaeology and archaeological evidence and sort of like the settlement landscape, what's happening, because essentially what population replacement means is that one group were able to have, over potentially hundreds of years, were able to have more children that lived to adulthood than the other group. And that could happen through a number of different ways. I mean, to be honest, the quickest way for it to happen is for one group to have even a slightly slightly lower infant mortality rate than the other group. That's the biggest thing that over the long term will massively increase your chances of your descendants living till adulthood and having descendants themselves, or having more descendants, having a greater genetic legacy in the long term, is your infant mortality is really low. But very rarely do people talk about these at least in the popular discourse, talk about these population changes in being that one population came along with a different lifestyle, which meant that they had more children who lived to adulthood. And that's got to be part of these conversations. I mean, this is not to deny that in some cases that there was disease involved and there was violence involved between groups of migrants, but in order to argue groups of migrants and groups of local people, but in order to argue that, you have to bring in the evidence for it. And there's sort of a steppe ancestry linked to Yamnaya groups from the Pontic-Caspian steppe that happens in the sort of late Neolithic to Bronze Age Europe. It's kind of a case in point. I mean, you get these huge ancestry shifts over potentially centuries. I mean, particularly in Britain, that eventually introduced these steppe ancestries into Britain. But this is sort of happening over hundreds of years, and there's no evidence from the osteology for any uptick in violence around that. Yeah, it's like Britain has one of the largest population replacements at this time, or ancestry shifts in Europe as a result of people who carry these steppe ancestries, and yet we. There's no mass burials. We don't see any increase in violence on the skeletons, sort of trauma on the skeletons, and people argue that maybe we only have the victors, but then it's like, well, if they're fighting these people, then surely they're going to get injured as well. Yep. So there's none of that. There's no real discussion as to what. It's just assumed. There's no discussion as to, all right, well, what is the advantage that this incoming population have over the local population militarily that means they're able to produce this kind of thing? And I feel like that to argue for things like genocide in the past, it's an extraordinary thing to have happened. So you need extraordinary evidence to be able to prove it. And the genetic change by itself is not enough to be able to do that. Particularly, there's other mechanisms, social structure in particular, which we know that a lot of the times when you get these migrations of populations, including potentially in the early period, you get these situations where you have groups with different ancestries living alongside one another and only having children infrequently. So with that level of what geneticists often call structure in the data, or separation, if one of these groups that's carrying these ancestries is having more children live to adulthood, if they have different lifestyles, if they have different access to resources, which allows them to have more children, very quickly their ancestry, even with some later mixing with or with more liberal mixing later on, their ancestry will come to dominate the ancestral landscape. And this is something that might not have even been something that happened consciously. People weren't aware that this ancestry was becoming that. They would have been aware that people there was a stage where people were aware that groups of people were moving in and migrating into a new place. but people wouldn't necessarily been aware over these timescales that the genetics of these groups was shifting, because people's idea of their identity and their links to different places changes over time.
Yeah, and that's where you have to be careful about language. People have described that sort of arrangement as apartheid, which of course is super loaded, and not that long ago we knew what that really meant. So the way I think about it, it's a little bit crude, but genetics can tell us the who these people were, where they came from, along with isotopes and maybe what happened on a big scale, but you need archaeology to tell you the how and the why, and that's often a lot more complicated.
And it's hard to get over bias as well sometimes, in that, particularly in this period in the Bronze Age, when you get these people carrying steppe ancestries. They carry other ancestries as well, but around 50% of their ancestry originates distally from the Pontic-Caspian steppe into Britain. Before they arrive, we hardly have any in the late Neolithic in Britain from around 3000 BC. We hardly have any human remains, because people are either cremating the dead or doing something with them that leaves no archaeological record. And then suddenly you have these when these groups start migrating into Britain, you get these really visible burials under big mounds, single burials, not cremated, with sometimes ostentatious grave goods in sort of obvious sites. And that's where most of our sample is coming from. And if the people who were here previous to these migrations continued in their traditions of cremating or doing things with the dead that leave no record,
they're invisible.
We wouldn't see them in the genetic record. Pre-genetics, I wouldn't have believed that you could have that happen and there be such strong structure between the two groups that you wouldn't see one group reflecting the genetics of another. There'd be too much mixing.
Yep.
But there's evidence from other parts of continental Europe, and indeed to some extent in Britain as well, that there is strong structure between these groups, and that at least the people who were being buried in these very ostentatious ways belong to a specific part of the population, and you're getting a biased view of the ancestry of the people in that place. Eventually that ancestry does come to predominate, but then at the same time, these other groups that are derived from the late Neolithic populations of Britain are sort of persisting next to them, and then eventually they emerge, and it's only hundreds of years later, when they merge together, that you see this big disparity in their genetic legacy. And so what those processes could be in the middle are likely to involve lots of different things. Maybe violence is one of them, and probably disease as well, but also, different social structures with certain people maybe ending up on the top of society.
Yeah, and as there weren't nations per se at that time, it probably differed from, village to village. So
absolutely. The interesting thing about prehistory is some of the, albeit relatively sort of questionable measures of population size that you can get from genetics. You can get this thing called effective population size, which isn't census population size, and it's difficult to relate it to census population size. But taking it at face value, it suggests that population sizes across Europe, really, and in Britain specifically, weren't all that large through prehistory up until maybe around 3,000 years ago, maybe about 1,000 BC, maybe a bit earlier than that, 1,500 BC. So you can see how when populations are living at quite low density or quite dispersed, how firstly, movements of people could have happened into new areas without there necessarily coming into serious conflict with other groups or local groups, if essentially they're moving into empty space. But also you can see how even slight advantages in terms of birth rate or living to reproductive age of one group over another leads to really big differences, because if the populations are small anyway, then even slight differences are going to have a big effect.
And it could be over dramatized when you look at it, in hindsight.
Particularly when you have potentially a bias towards the people with the descendants of the migrants as well. That's primarily who you were seeing in the record.
Yep. All right, so we've covered a lot of ground. Obviously, aDNA is changing the discipline a lot. We're learning a lot about it. I think it's fair to say that archaeologists and geneticists are learning to play more nicely together, so a little more harmonious. Now, looking forward, just as a final question, what is one question that you're dying to answer that you think aDNA can answer?
I would say probably, still going back to this, I want to see what the population in late Neolithic Britain looked like. And this is tricky because, as we're saying, they have, and how long they persisted, because they had, and this is not really so much dependent upon the DNA techniques themselves, more the human remains that we can get and the data we can get out of them. Because there's an idea in the late Neolithic, and this might explain some of the scale of the population change that happens later, that there, at least in parts of Britain, there is a demographic decline, and people call it, sort of some failure of agriculture or something, but it might just be simply an adaptation, that agriculture wasn't working so well. People started moving towards a more pastoralist system, but that means you can't maintain as much, your population sizes aren't as big, and so people are living at sort of a lower density than they had been previously, at least in certain regions of Britain. And the problem is that, and you might be able to see that in the DNA by looking at this change in effective population size. But the problem is, as I was saying, because of cremation, because of them doing things with the dead that leaves no record, them being mean to future archaeologists like me, and decided to dispose of the dead in ways that we can't see. We hardly have any genomes from that period, and we don't really have a good understanding of what's going on genetically to the population, at least in mainland Britain. And sort of understanding that is the key to understanding the kind of population changes that occurs later with the introduction of the steppe ancestry by these migrants that are associated with the Beaker cultural phenomenon. And also potentially picking up on more, we have a few already, but more individuals that have potentially more of the ancestry from the late Neolithic populations of Britain, and what kind of context they were buried in, how they were treated in death, which might give a hint of what this population is doing, how they're interacting with these communities of migrants and their descendants in that space, and how their interaction changes over time. Because it definitely does change. You can see that culturally when, sorry, this is never to take a deeper dive, when these groups of migrants first arrive in Britain, if you look at just the Beaker pottery, for instance, the Beaker pottery that they're producing is very much similar to the Beaker pottery they get in continental Europe from the places where they're from. But a couple of hundred years later, you get this explosion in diversity of styles of Beaker pottery that seems to incorporate motifs that were more common amongst the local population. So there seems to be this interesting interaction. You see this at sites like Stonehenge as well, which was built almost certainly by the main phase of Stonehenge, which people associate with Stonehenge, the big trilithons, was almost certainly built by the sort of late Neolithic descended people. But then clearly the monument becomes something that these groups of migrants and their descendants became interested in and started playing around with as well. And it's interesting thinking about the interactions between those groups, because they didn't knock it down. It wasn't iconoclastic. So it wasn't sort of on the bottom end of total disrespect. They seemed to in some way incorporate that monument into their own belief system, despite presumably not having encountered anything like it previously. So it's interesting thinking about those dynamics. And there's one of my favourite Bronze Age burials from Stonehenge, which was found in the ditch that surrounds the Stonehenge monument. It's called the Stonehenge Archer. And it's called the Stonehenge Archer despite the fact that the arrowheads that were found with him were actually embedded in his body. So he'd been shot point blank range by an arrow and killed. And possibly some people speculate a ritual execution is the only unburnt burial in the actual Stonehenge monument itself. You have cremations that were put in some of the holes where the stones are, but they were all burnt. This was the only unburnt one. So he will be an interesting test case to see to what extent he has ancestry deriving from these populations of migrants, to what extent he has ancestry from the local Neolithic populations, and what that means for the understanding of how that monument was understood by these different communities that were living in Britain at the beginning of the Bronze Age.
So we will stay tuned for that. I'm sure we'll hear about it. You're active on social media, so people can find you. Thanks a lot for sitting down with me. It's been a fascinating talk.
No, it's no problem, Jason. Hope that was useful.
All right. Thanks a lot.
Cheers.
All right. Hey, If you like what you heard, give me that thumbs up below, hit that bell to subscribe, or if you want to support more independent archaeology content, consider contributing to my Patreon, where you can enjoy some exclusive members-only benefits and other goodies. Until the next dig.